Thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you, Malala, as well. We're going to pick up now on some of the threads of that conversation. We spoke this morning about the opportunity of AI. And if you look at estimates of the economic value, it could be between 17 and $25 trillion globally. In Europe, increasing the size of the economy by 1.2 trillion euros. But the workforce needs to be ready. Just as Deputy Secretary General was saying, how do we equip people with the skills that they need for the future? Well, that's why back in 2015, Yonca and I were asked to look after Europe, Middle East and Africa together, and with our teams, we launched a program we called Grow with Google, which Ruth mentioned, and it was about digital skills. At the time, the EU had said, we think there could be 1 million jobs that don't go filled because of a lack of digital skills. So we thought, let's try and train 1 million people in 2 years. We were blown away by demand. We trained 1 million in the first year, and scroll forward today, we trained 24 million people in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, always in partnership with governments, educators, trade unions, small business associations, NGOs, and local communities. But that's not enough. What we see is, are those people going on to grow their careers, start a business, learn and put to use what they've learned? And in many cases, they are. Now those programs are at least 50-50 male-female. But now we need to grapple with the oncoming challenge of AI. And nobody knows yet what AI will do to the world of work. There's lots of speculation, but we need to start. And so we recently launched an AI Opportunity Initiative for Europe. Learning from all that experience, working in partnership, we committed 25 million euros from google.org to support AI training for skills and people across the region, with a particular focus on more vulnerable communities and the roles that might be at more risk of being impacted. So we know that providing that economic opportunity and learning can be life-changing as well as unlocking prosperity. And so we turn to our next speaker. Professor Abhijit Banerjee has written a book on exactly this, alongside his wife, Professor Esther Duflo. It's called Good Economics for Hard Times. I can highly recommend it. It looks to provide better answers to our biggest problems. It draws on their own economic research to advocate for pragmatic solutions to issues from stagnating growth to education inequalities we were just talking about, to climate change and immigration. And for their work, Esther and Abhijit were awarded the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2019. They also co-founded the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Lab, known as JPAL. And google.org is proud to be a supporter over the last 5 years of their work. So we're delighted to have Abhijit Banerjee with us today. Please welcome Abhijit to the stage. Thank you. Welcome. Thank you very much, Abhijit.
Thank you.
Sartorially brilliant as well as a Nobel Prize winner. So what drove you to this mission that you and Esther have had on poverty and your work on poverty, and why is economics the weapon of choice?
You know, when I was started out to be an economist, everybody knew the answer. And it was the time of the Washington Consensus, and we were told that the government invests in education, maybe in health, and then the markets take care of it. And then, if you looked around and you actually had spent some time on the ground, I grew up in India in relatively, not particularly prosperous place, you would notice that somehow that story didn't hang together. And one of the things that struck me is that even when you tell me governments invest in education, what does that mean? I mean, they buy books, they build schools, they do whatever, hire teachers. What does that sentence translate into? And it turned out that when you looked into it, actually nobody knew the answer to what's the right thing to do. And then we started, but everybody had answers, of course, but not based on much. And we started doing randomized controlled trials on these things. Large-scale trials where, the first one I did, we tested this idea that, you double the number of teachers per student, it must be great. And everybody told us it would be great. It had no effect. And then we started scratching our head and digging a bit deeper and trying to figure out what actually was going wrong in these schools. Why weren't the children learning? And that's sort of how we got kind of drunk on this agenda of, maybe if we ask more questions, we'll learn something.
But yeah, at the heart of your method is this randomized controlled trials and providing a more experimental and sort of scientific method to getting to what you described as as the facts there. Maybe could you take us through an example? I know your work with malaria is an interesting one, which would explain a bit to us how you apply that from an idea to actual impact.
So, on malaria is actually a great success story. I think it's easy to get weighed down by the cares of the world, but one of the things that's happened in the last 15 years is deaths of young children from malaria has been halved.
Yeah.
That's an enormous success story. How did it happen? Well, I think for a very long time we knew that the technology actually existed. The technology was insecticide-treated bed nets, and that was available. It was just not being used. Why?
Bed nets?
Bed nets. Children under 5 should sleep under bed nets, at least in places where there's falciparum malaria. Turns out that those were too expensive, and people weren't buying them. And there was always this debate, why don't you give them away? And the answer was always given, if you give them away, people won't use them because they don't value them if it's free. So eventually, one of our colleagues in the Poverty Action Lab, Pascaline Dupin, two colleagues, and Jessica Cohen, decided to do a test. Jessica was one of my students. And the test was just a randomized control trial. A whole bunch of hospitals started giving away these bed nets to half the people who were showing up and not to others. And then they would go to their homes at night and see if the children were sleeping under bed nets. Turns out it made no difference whether you got it free or not. Zero. And so that was first answer. It didn't make no difference. So should we give it away? Well, there was a second round of objections. People don't like spending money, so there's always objections. So there was, but if you give it away free, there'll be corruption. So they did another randomized control trial where they had, different mechanisms for giving away these things and trying to see if there was corruption. And there was really no corruption at all, but it made no difference whether you gave it away or not. So it turns out that the answer was very simple. We had basically let a lot of children die because we hadn't taken the trouble to look at the evidence. The evidence was very simple, which is that if you give away bed nets, people use them and the children live. And we see now that policy shifted around 10 years ago or 12 years ago towards giving away bed nets, and you see an immediate decline in the number of children dying from malaria, children under 5 dying from malaria. So it's very straightforward.
You make it sound very straightforward, but it obviously wasn't because it hadn't happened for a long period of time.
Well, I think it's precisely what you said, which is that I think the power of doing a randomized control trial where you tie your hands and you say, okay, I'm going to randomly assign it here and not there and see what happens, is that in the end, when you see the result, it's hard to argue that it's something else.
Yeah, absolutely. So very powerful stuff. And then getting from those tests to real impact and to halving the child deaths from malaria, what did that take? Was it?
Well, I think the results were sufficiently compelling that even the organizations like PFI, which were doing this kind of work, as contractors for USAID selling bed nets, decided it was just better to do it the way give them away free. So I think it was just a quite quick move towards giving these bed nets away rather than selling them.
Right, so once they saw it, they just adopted the policy.
This was one of the cases where that seemed like it happened faster than I actually expected.
So maybe let's take on an issue which has been hanging around this room today, and I think is on lots of people's minds, which is to do with the future of work. We just heard a little bit about that in the last conversation. So when you think about the future of work, we have these ideas now of, technology is going to mean that, many of us will just not have jobs and we need a universal basic income. I know you've been involved in some trials in that area. Tell us how should we think about the future of work? What do we need to do there?
So I think the one thing we know about future of work is we know very little.
We know very little.
I think we really don't know. I think everybody says that, yes, these jobs will be lost, but will be other jobs. But if I ask people to name those other jobs, then it gets a little thinner on the ground. So I'm going to take it as given that right now, the one thing we can do to future-proof the economy is to create mechanisms by which people who lose jobs won't immediately be, helpless. And I think if you I say one thing which people forget, people say that, well, it was the Industrial Revolution and people thought it would be a disaster. It wasn't. In fact, it was a disaster. It took 75 years for real wages in the UK to get back to, from 1760, real wages fall. And they fall till 1825. It's in 1825 that the wages catch up. So it's not the case that...
Very long period of adjustment.
Yes. So, that's several generations of people who were hit by the technology. And I think we should take that as a good model for what will happen. There'll be, eventually, I'm sure the world will benefit from it, but I wouldn't like to be the person who's says, well, the world is benefiting, but your job is gone. So,
and do you think in this cycle, so we talk a lot about the speed of change, obviously 70% of the planet connected and AI moving incredibly fast. Do you think the adjustment period will be shorter? Can you speculate about what's ahead of us?
I think the question is exactly the one I don't know the answer to, which is what new jobs will take. What's the elasticity of demand? As an economist, if I create new jobs, there'll be new products. How much does the world want those new products? Is it really like something that everybody is going to use and therefore it's going to be vast? Yeah. Or will it be the case that eventually most of the useful sort of grunge work will be done by AI and there'll be a few really talented people using AI to do wonderful things, but there won't be really enough jobs for the most people? I don't know the answer to that question.
So we could speculate about all kinds of scenarios. People talk about, well, most jobs will be the same, but it's a bit like electricity. It will change your productivity. Some will go away, but some new industries will be created. But we can't be certain.
I think right now what we should think of is, social support mechanisms that if we don't need them, it doesn't hurt. If we do, we should think about them.
So maybe tell us a little bit about some of the work you've been doing.
So I think the universal basic income is an interesting one because people use this term very happily for things which are neither universal nor basic nor income.
Okay.
That's
quite confusing.
Yeah, but it's most trials of universal basic income, there are actually a bunch of them, turn out to be targeted. Or they're targeted to low-income people, which is perfectly reasonable, but they're not...
It's not universal.
It's not universal. They're not... Often the amounts given are $100, $300, so it's not actually basic income either. And often it's not income. It's a one-time transfer or 6-month transfer, or it's not income. It's something that you get for a long period of time. So it's none of those. And then there is a whole set of issues about whether this income should be, should it be income? Should it be an asset? Should you need training to use the asset? How much of it should be skilling? How much should it be actually the transfer? There's a whole set of issues. And one of the things that we've been doing for the last now 15 years or so is sort of studying those different pieces. So there are lots of randomized controlled trials addressing different pieces of it. So is it important that, for example, it's cash rather than food or some housing or something? And the answer is apparently in most places, no. There are many, many of these randomized controlled trials. People given cash behave exactly the same way as people who are given food. They eat the same amounts. It doesn't change anything. People substitute. If you give them food, they buy something else. It doesn't change anything. There is a number of question of, who should you, give it to? Is it the case that, is it important to give it to the woman in the household? So far, very little evidence that it makes any difference. Despite, I think, a lot of
the received wisdom is that...
Yeah, including mine. I should be...
Okay.
I mean, one advantage of experiments is that you can be wrong.
How does it work in your house? Because your wife's a Nobel Prize-winning economist too.
Yeah, well, she has better judgment, so I trust her on everything.
Okay, we won't get into the marital thing.
Yeah. But
so the evidence suggests it makes no difference.
It makes no difference. And now, then there's questions about, should it be lump sum? Should you get the amount, So we had a randomized control trial, which was a universal basic income, meaning everyone in the villages where they got it. So, and we looked at whether this had, it was for 12 years, so quite long term. And the question we asked is it the case that rather than giving you the money that you would get over 12 years, we'll just take 1/6 of it, basically, and give it to you lump sum. So what you would have got in 2 years, I give it into you. Look at what the effect on consumption is. And the striking fact is that getting it lump sum, A, people want it, people want lump sums, and second, they seem to behave in a way that raises their incomes more when they get the lump sum. So less money actually generates, at least in the short run, better outcomes if it's lump sum, because people start, with a lump sum, people can start a business easily. Yeah. With a small amount every day, you'll have to save and figure out a way to start a business, and that gets more complicated. So turns out, right now, the evidence suggests that there's not a huge gain to sort of breaking it up into small chunks, rather than giving it to you all at once, and then you do what you want with it. And many people fix their houses, and then they don't have to fix it again, or they start a business, and that seems to work well. So that's another class of questions. Third class of questions do you need to give, so at least for the people who are really at the bottom, people who have really had no chance, that's a lot of the people who we have been studying actually are from, for example, are, women who were never in the labor force, then their husband abandons them, what do they do? So these kinds of people, the question was, do they need both training and transfers, or just training? And the answer seems to be that at least for those people, training is actually useful. Mm-hmm. You have to actually, there was a good example, there was a woman who started a business with selling trinkets, and she had to go to the market, buy trinkets, and come and sell it. And she was given training, so she turned out that she didn't know how to take a bus. So the training was, you get into this bus, and you go, get off there, you buy the trinkets, you come back. So the week after that, she sold us the trinkets, she was going back to the market. And then she comes back and calls the person who trained her and said, well, I couldn't find a bus. I got on the yellow bus last time, and there was no yellow bus this time. So it turned out that she didn't know that buses have numbers, because she couldn't read numbers. So, there's a series of these. So it's easy to say, you give people resources and they'll be creative. But you have to think of the context within which they have lived. These were often people who got married at 13, had children at 15, and never had a chance to, have any skills that were, usable in the world, other than, inside their home. And, for those people, you need other things than money. So there's a whole range of issues. Basically, this studying universal basic income is a good language for studying many, many different issues that affect the lives of the poor.
It's amazing work. I'm going to come to any questions or comments from the audience in a second, so please do make yourself known if you'd like to make a contribution. So there's obviously still more work. It's not really universal basic income, as you say. It's more about interventions that help people move out of poverty. What are the next things that you're focused on working on or learning from these kinds of studies?
So I think there are many, many different issues. One of them is, one of the things that we are thinking about is, how does one, we talk a lot about, people are going to be creative. They're going to, there's all these opportunities. AI will create opportunities. They'll be entrepreneurial. Question is, how do you make sure that those who are entrepreneurial actually get the opportunities? Yeah. And one of there's an interesting set of studies now showing that, in fact, within communities, people actually know who's entrepreneurial. Yeah. So there's a study where they went and asked people, within your group, who's the best entrepreneur? And they did it so in a way that people couldn't just say it's me. So they asked that, and then they divided the people into 3 groups. Okay, the people most people thought was great, people thought most people were mediocre, people who thought who were not great. And then they did a randomized controlled trial where half of each of these groups got $100 to invest in whatever they wanted to invest. The people who were in the bottom third had 0% return on $100.
Okay.
The people who were in the top third had 30% per month return on the $100. Yeah. So you can see that there's just enormous diversity.
So the wisdom of the crowds could see the entrepreneurs.
But the financial system couldn't because they didn't have money. There were no. So in some sense, it's saying that one of the things I'm excited about is how to design a world where this narrative about there's talent out there, but it's not a matter of just throwing money at random. It's a matter of identifying people, of taking the talented and pushing them, and that seems to me to be a very exciting place in this sort of livelihoods agenda. That's an exciting place.
I'm struck by a number of the examples you've given us where actually the received wisdom was overturned by human nature and people doing the right things for themselves despite what the economists might have judged they were going to do with the resources.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the advantages of being experimental is that you learn a certain amount of humility. I mean, at this point, I feel like I'm often asked opinions about many things, and I realize that the best thing I can do is first best thing I can do is say that I don't know anything. The second best thing, which is often what I end up doing, is saying that it could be this or it could be that till people get bored and they stop asking me the question.
Let's take a question from the floor, number 3 over here. Thank you.
It's Sharon White. I may now no longer ask my question, but one of the most striking things you talked about was a 75-year transition for real living standards to get back to where they were at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And so my question is linking this to the discussion we had on liberal democracy. If you're an AI skeptic, do you think liberal democracy can withstand 75 years to transition, and/or that the beneficiaries of AI are prepared to pay for a safety net, a basic income safety net for those who lose out?
Yeah, so I think you're answering your own question. So I think I think the beneficiary of AI need to pay for it, or else, the political consequences. We already see what the political consequences of the last episode of saying, well, trade is going to be great for everybody, except you forget that trade is mostly small gains for many people and large losses for some people. And you can see where a very good predictor of where Trump gets his votes is where they used to produce things that China now produces.
Yeah.
And there's a paper showing exactly that. So it's not random. We knew who's going to get upset, who's going to get hurt, and we didn't do anything about it. I think we can't afford to do that. Yeah. I think we will know ahead of time which are the people who lose their jobs. And interestingly, and that's why the universal basic income conversation is interesting. It's not going to be necessarily the poorest people. Yeah. It's a lot of people who do, for example, in India, it's going to be a lot of people who do medical transcription, low-level coding, low-level animation. These kinds of things, AI will do so much better and so much faster that their jobs are going to be gone. These are not the poorest people. They're the middle class.
And we touched on this in some of the conversations earlier as well, that AI can potentially change access to education for some of the poorest people and allow them already to understand complexity and write in a way that they might have not been educated to do.
That's right. So I wasn't necessarily saying, I was echoing the question, which is that I think there will be a need to pay for, I think, a set of people who are going to definitely be hurt in the short run.
Yeah.
And I think the question is how much we anticipate that, how will we target that, how will we do at identifying the people who, it's the furniture maker in North Carolina who lost his job because China was exporting the furnitures, who's now upset and votes for Trump. And I think we could do the equivalent with AI. We would know. I think we could know.
Yeah, well, it's our job to get ahead of it. A question over here, thank you. We'll take one more question, I think, so thank you.
Hi, Mina Al-Arabi. My question is, we just heard from Amina Mohammed about the Summit for the Future. So there's this anticipation in September, the world comes together, and one of the 3 points that she mentioned was the financial architecture. So if you could wave a wand and really impose a change in this summit that's coming in September and get political leaders to make a change, what would it be when it comes to financial architecture in the world?
You know, I think financial architecture is a big word. I think it's money. I think the real constraint for
This is the first economist I've ever heard who simplified something so beautifully, so thank you very much.
I'm mostly very good at obscurantism, but in this particular case, I'm going to
keep going.
Stick to the. I think that with the SDGs, I was involved with Amina. I was in the panel that framed the SDGs, and we were full of hope that with this wonderful message of all the great things we're going to do, there'll be money. And no money came forth. I mean, the first order fact is that since 2015, the share of money given at aid went down for a while and has gone up a little bit, but is really not changed. I think that money that's available, sort of fund, even loans that are concessional, that the volume of that hasn't gone up as a share of world GDP. It's gone down slightly. I think it's very straightforward. I mean, we could do something about this 0.8% commitment that no country almost respects. We could go there. There are many simple things that could be done which would make it easier to implement the SDGs. And then I think with climate, there's a whole other set of issues on who's going to pay for the adaptation. And the countries which are going to be most affected are going to be the least able to pay for the adaptation. And again, that's money. I think we really need to get down to the brass tacks. And it's not complicated funding mechanism. It's just first order. There needs to be much more money around if we really want to put get behind our words.
Well, Abhijit, thank you so much for helping us to see a bit more clearly on everything. And I can recommend the book, Good Economics for Hard Times. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Abhijit. Thank you very much. Thank you. So, highly recommend the book he wrote with Esther, Good Economics for Hard Times.